I found out my de-icing salt bags were missing on the coldest morning of December, standing in my garage at 5:30 in the morning with my breath fogging the air and my driveway looking like a skating rink. My name is Oliver Zimmerman, and I had lived in the Riverside Meadows community in Springfield, Illinois, for 3 years without any major problems. The HOA had always been somewhat intrusive, but nothing too extreme until this winter. I worked as an IT consultant from home most days, which meant I was around the neighborhood more than most residents who commuted to Chicago or worked downtown. That morning, I needed to get to a client meeting in Decatur, and the ice on my driveway was at least 2 inches thick after the freezing rain we had gotten overnight. I stood there staring at the empty corner of my garage where I kept my winter supplies. I had purchased 6 20-pound bags of de-icing salt just 2 weeks ago from the hardware store on MacArthur Boulevard. I remembered stacking them carefully against the wall, right next to my snow shovel and the bag of sand I used for traction. The sand was still there. The shovel was still there. But all 6 bags of salt had vanished. My first thought was that maybe I had moved them somewhere and forgotten, but I knew that was impossible. I had a specific place for everything in my garage, a habit my father had drilled into me when I was growing up. Everything had its spot, and those salt bags had been in their spot just 2 days ago, when I had grabbed a bag to treat the sidewalk after a light dusting of snow. I walked around my garage, checking behind my lawn mower, looking in the corners, even opening my car trunk to see if I had inexplicably moved them there. Nothing. They were simply gone. The overhead door had been closed and locked, and the side door that led to my backyard had been secured with a deadbolt. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing that would indicate a break-in. Standing in my garage wearing my pajamas and a winter coat, I felt a mix of confusion and frustration. Who steals de-icing salt? It was not exactly high-value merchandise. Even at the hardware store, those bags cost maybe $8 each. The whole lot was worth less than $50. But without it, I was stuck. I tried throwing some sand on the driveway, but it did not help much with the solid sheet of ice that had formed overnight. I ended up calling my client to reschedule, then spent the next hour carefully chipping away at the ice with a metal scraper, nearly falling twice in the process. By the time I made the driveway somewhat passable, I was sweating despite the 20-degree temperature, and I was annoyed enough to start investigating what had happened to my salt. The next day, I drove to the hardware store and bought 4 more bags. This time, I made a point of noting the time and date, and I even took a picture of the bags stacked in my garage. If they disappeared again, I would at least have evidence that I was not losing my mind. I also started paying more attention to the neighborhood, watching for anything unusual. Riverside Meadows was a community of about 200 homes, all built in the early 2000s with that cookie-cutter suburban aesthetic that looked nice but felt somewhat sterile. Wide streets, matching mailboxes, strict rules about lawn maintenance and exterior decorations. The HOA board consisted of 5 members, with Heather Kinsley serving as the president for the past 4 years. She was a woman in her early 50s with short blonde hair that she kept in that specific style that somehow screamed, "I want to speak to the manager." She drove a white Lexus SUV and lived in one of the larger houses on Willow Creek Drive, 3 streets over from my place on Maple Ridge Court. I had dealt with Heather a few times over minor issues. Once she had sent me a violation notice because my trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though I had just brought them back from the curb and was planning to put them away within the hour. Another time she had questioned the color of the flowers I planted in my front garden, suggesting that they did not match the community aesthetic guidelines outlined in the HOA handbook. Both times I had resolved the issues, but her tone and attitude had left a bad impression. She was the type of person who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from enforcing rules and finding violations. 3 days after I bought the replacement salt bags, I went into my garage one morning and found that 2 of them were missing. Not all 4 this time, just 2. They had been taken during the night, sometime between when I had gone to bed around 11 and when I woke up at 6. My garage door had been closed. The side door had been locked. Yet 2 bags were gone. This time I was not just annoyed. I was genuinely concerned. Someone was specifically targeting my salt supplies, and they were getting into my garage without leaving any trace. I walked around my property, checking for footprints in the patches of snow that remained in my yard. I found some prints near the side of my garage, but they were smudged and unclear. They could have been from the mail carrier from me, or from whoever was taking my salt. I decided to call my neighbor, an older man named Richard who lived next door and who I occasionally talked to about sports and neighborhood matters. Richard was retired from the railroad and spent most of his time working in his garden when the weather allowed it. He was a reasonable guy, the kind of neighbor who would help jump-start your car or lend you a tool without making a big deal about it. "Hey, Richard," I said when he answered his door. "Have you noticed anything weird lately? Anyone hanging around our garages or anything like that?" Richard scratched his white beard and thought about it. "Cannot say that I have, Oliver. Why do you ask? Someone has been taking my de-icing salt. 2 times now. Bags just disappearing from my garage." His eyebrows went up. "That is odd. Who would steal salt?" "That is what I am trying to figure out. You have not had anything go missing." "No, but then again, I do not keep much in my garage these days. Just the lawn mower and some old boxes. But I will keep an eye out. You might want to mention it at the next HOA meeting." The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I decided to attend. I typically avoided these meetings because they tended to be tedious affairs, where people argued about minutiae like the exact shade of beige that garage doors should be painted, or whether someone's wreath was too large according to the decoration guidelines. But this time, I had a legitimate concern to raise. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that also served as a gym and gathering space. About 30 residents showed up, which was apparently a good turnout according to Richard, who had come with me. Heather Kinsley sat at the front table with the other board members. Tom, a middle-aged accountant, Susan, a retired teacher, Bill, who worked in insurance, and Margaret, a nurse who worked night shifts at the hospital. Heather called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel, which seemed unnecessarily dramatic for a homeowners association meeting. She went through the usual agenda items: budget reports, upcoming maintenance projects, complaints about various violations. Then she opened the floor for resident concerns. I raised my hand and stood up when she acknowledged me. "I wanted to report a theft," I said. "Someone has been taking de-icing salt from my garage. It has happened twice now, and I am concerned about security in the neighborhood." Heather looked at me with an expression that somehow managed to be both concerned and dismissive at the same time. "De-icing salt? How much are we talking about?" 6 bags the first time, 2 bags the second time, all taken from my locked garage." "Are you certain you locked your garage, Mr. Zimmerman?" She emphasized the word certain in a way that suggested she thought I was probably at fault. "Yes, I am certain. Both the overhead door and the side entrance were locked both times." "Well, that is concerning. she said in a tone that indicated it was not particularly concerning to her. Have you filed a police report? Not yet. I wanted to bring it up here first, see if anyone else had experienced similar thefts. She looked around the room. Has anyone else had issues with missing items? A few people shook their heads. One woman in the back said she thought someone had taken some gardening tools from her shed last summer, but she was not sure. No one else reported missing salt specifically. I suggest you file a police report if you believe a theft has occurred, Heather said. The HOA cannot really do much about individual property theft, but we can remind residents to keep their garages and sheds locked. I will include a notice in next month's newsletter. That was basically the end of the discussion. The meeting moved on to a heated debate about whether Christmas lights should be required to come down by January 5th or January 15th. I sat there feeling like my concern had been brushed aside, but I was not sure what else I could do. After the meeting, I approached Heather directly. She was gathering her papers and talking to Susan about something related to the neighborhood budget. "Excuse me, Heather," I said. "Can I ask you something about the salt situation?" She turned to me with an impatient expression. "Yes, Mr. Zimmerman. Does the HOA keep any communal supplies? Salt for the sidewalks, anything like that? We have a small supply shed near the entrance where we keep some equipment for maintaining the common areas." "Why?" I was just wondering if maybe someone thought they were taking from communal supplies rather than stealing from residents. She gave me a tight smile. "Our supply shed is locked and only board members have keys, and we certainly have plenty of de-icing salt. We stock up every fall. In fact, we probably have more than we need this year." Something about the way she said it struck me as odd, but I could not put my finger on exactly what. I thanked her and left, deciding that I would take her advice and file a police report, even though I doubted anything would come of it. The next morning, I went to the Springfield Police Department and filed a report about the missing salt. The officer who took my statement was professional but clearly did not see this as a high-priority crime. He gave me a case number and said someone might follow up, but I should not expect much in terms of investigation for what amounted to petty theft with no evidence. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went to an electronics store and bought a wireless security camera system with night vision and motion detection. I spent an afternoon installing cameras at both entrances to my garage, positioning them to capture anyone who approached. The system connected to my phone, so I would get alerts whenever motion was detected. I also bought 8 more bags of salt and stacked them prominently in my garage. If someone was going to steal them, I wanted to catch them on camera this time. For the first few nights, nothing happened. The cameras caught me coming and going, captured some stray cats prowling around, recorded Richard taking out his trash. But no thieves, no missing salt. I started to wonder if maybe the cameras themselves were enough of a deterrent. Then, on the 5th night, at 2:17 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I grabbed it from my nightstand and opened the camera app, my heart pounding. The night vision footage showed a figure approaching my garage from the side yard. They were wearing dark clothes and moved quickly and purposefully. I watched as they went to the side door of my garage. I expected them to try to pick the lock or force the door, but instead, they pulled out a key and simply unlocked it. They had a key to my garage. I watched in disbelief as the person slipped inside, and a moment later the interior camera showed them clearly. It was Heather Kinsley, the HOA president, loading my salt bags into a large canvas shopping bag. I could not believe what I was seeing. She made 2 trips, taking 4 bags total, then locked the door behind her and disappeared into the night. The whole operation took less than 5 minutes. I sat in my bed, staring at my phone screen, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The president of our HOA was stealing my de-icing salt in the middle of the night. But more disturbing than the theft itself was the fact that she had a key to my garage. How did she have a key? I did not confront her that night. Instead, I saved the footage to multiple locations: my phone, my computer, a cloud backup service. I wanted to make sure I had solid evidence before I took any action. The timestamp was clear, the footage was high quality, and Heather's face was clearly visible in several frames. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had all my locks changed. The locksmith was a talkative guy named Dave who ran his own small business in Springfield. While he was working on the side door, I asked him about the previous lock. "This is a pretty standard residential deadbolt," he said, examining it. "Nothing fancy but decent security. Has this ever been rekeyed?" "Not that I know of. I bought the house 3 years ago and never changed the locks." "You should always change locks when you move into a new place," Dave said. "You never know who might have copies of the old keys. Previous owners, contractors, whoever. Could someone make a copy of this key without having the original? Not easily. They would need either the original key or detailed specifications." "Why do you ask?" I decided not to tell him about the theft, just curious about security. After Dave finished and left, I sat down to think through the situation. Heather had a key to my garage, which meant she either had access to a master key of some sort, or she had somehow obtained or copied my key. In HOA communities, especially newer developments, it was not uncommon for the HOA or the developer to retain master keys to certain locks, supposedly for emergency access. But using such a key to steal from residents was obviously illegal and a massive breach of trust. I needed to know if other people had experienced similar thefts. I decided to do some investigating in the neighborhood. Over the next few days, I walked around Riverside Meadows and talked to neighbors under the pretense of being concerned about neighborhood security. I knocked on doors, chatted with people I met on the street, and asked casual questions about whether they had noticed anything missing or strange. What I found was disturbing. At least 6 other residents reported having supplies go missing from their garages or sheds over the past 2 winters. One man said he had lost several bags of water softener salt. A woman mentioned that bags of fertilizer had disappeared from her garden shed. Another resident could not find the ice melt he had bought last winter. In every case, the items had disappeared without any signs of forced entry, and the residents had assumed they had either misplaced the items or forgotten that they had used them up. None of them had connected the disappearances or thought to report them as thefts. They were all relatively inexpensive items, the kind of thing you might not even notice was missing until you went looking for it. But a pattern was clearly emerging. I also learned something interesting from a woman named Patricia who had lived in Riverside Meadows since the community was first built. She mentioned that Heather Kinsley had been particularly aggressive about taking on responsibilities related to maintaining common areas and managing communal supplies. "She is always ordering stuff for the HOA," Patricia told me over coffee in her kitchen. "Salt for the sidewalks, supplies for the community center, that sort of thing. She handles most of it herself rather than delegating, says it is easier that way." "Does anyone check her receipts or audit the purchases?" Patricia shrugged. "There is supposed to be quarterly budget reviews, but Heather manages most of the financial records. Tom, the treasurer, probably looks at them, but I do not think anyone scrutinizes things too closely. Why would they? It is just the HOA." That evening, I requested copies of the HOA financial records. According to the bylaws, Any resident had the right to review the association's financial documents with reasonable notice. I sent an email to the HOA board making the request and citing the specific bylaw that granted me this right. Heather responded the next morning, asking why I wanted to see the records. I replied that as a paying member of the HOA, I was simply exercising my right to review how my dues were being spent. She sent back a terse message saying the records would be available for review at the next board meeting in 2 weeks. 2 weeks felt like a long time, but I decided to be patient and gather more evidence in the meantime. I kept my cameras running and reviewed the footage daily. Heather did not return to my garage, probably because she had already taken what she wanted and would not expect me to have bought more salt immediately. Instead, I started monitoring the neighborhood more carefully. I paid attention to when Heather drove through the streets, when lights were on at her house, when she seemed to be out and about. I was not stalking her exactly, but I was definitely keeping tabs on her movements within the public areas of our community. One afternoon, I saw her white Lexus parked near the community center with the back hatch open. She was unloading bags from the back, and I could see they were de-icing salt bags. The brand and type looked identical to the ones that had been stolen from me. She carried them into the supply shed behind the community center, making several trips. I waited until she left, then walked over to the community center. The supply shed was a simple metal structure with a padlock on the door. I could not see inside, but I took several photos of the exterior, the lock, and the area around it. I also noted that there were no security cameras pointed at the shed. As I stood there, Tom from the HOA board walked up, carrying some paperwork. "Hey, Oliver," he said. "What brings you by?" "Just taking a walk," I said. "Nice day despite the cold." "Sure is. You coming to the next meeting? I heard you had some concerns about theft." "Yes, I will be there. Actually, can I ask you something? How does the HOA handle inventory for supplies, like the salt and stuff kept in the shed?" Tom looked a bit uncomfortable. "Heather mostly handles that. She keeps spreadsheets of what we order and what we use." "Why?" "Just curious about how the process works. Do you ever audit the inventory? Check that what was ordered actually matches what is in the shed?" "Not really. I mean, I review the expenses when Heather submits receipts for reimbursement, but I do not physically count bags of salt or anything. That would be pretty tedious." "Does she get reimbursed a lot, a fair amount?" "She often buys supplies with her own credit card and then submits receipts to the HOA for reimbursement. It is actually pretty common. Several board members do it for convenience." I nodded, a picture forming in my mind. Heather was stealing supplies from residents, then stocking the HOA supply shed with the stolen items, and probably submitting receipts to the HOA for reimbursement, even though she had not actually purchased those supplies. It was a scam, and potentially a fairly profitable one if she had been doing it for multiple seasons. "How long has Heather been handling the supply purchases?" I asked. Tom thought about it. "Pretty much since she became president, so about 4 years now." 4 years. If she had been running this scam for 4 years, stealing from residents and defrauding the HOA, the total amount could be significant. Even if she only stole and falsely claimed $500 worth of supplies per year, that would be $2,000. And given the number of residents who had reported missing items, the real figure could be much higher. I thanked Tom and walked home, my mind working through the implications. This was not just petty theft anymore. This was fraud, potentially rising to the level of felony embezzlement depending on the amounts involved. I needed to be careful about how I proceeded. If I accused Heather without sufficient evidence, she could claim I was harassing her or making false accusations. But if I went to the police, I needed to have a solid case that they would take seriously. That night, I organized all my evidence. I had video footage of Heather entering my garage and stealing salt. I had photographs showing her unloading identical salt bags at the HOA supply shed. I had statements from multiple neighbors about missing supplies. I had information about the HOA's reimbursement process. What I did not have yet was direct evidence of fraudulent reimbursement claims. The next day, I called the Springfield Police Department and asked to speak with a detective about a theft and fraud case. I was transferred to Detective Sarah Morrison, who listened patiently as I explained the situation. "So you have video of this woman stealing from your garage?" she asked. "Yes, clear footage with timestamps. And she is the HOA president, so this is not just random theft. I believe she has been stealing from multiple residents and potentially defrauding the HOA. Can you send me the video footage?" I emailed her the files while we were still on the phone. There was a pause while she watched them. "Okay, this is pretty clear," she said. "She definitely entered your garage without permission and took your property. That is burglary, actually, since she entered a structure to commit theft. The fact that she apparently had a key does not matter. She did not have permission to be there. What about the broader fraud issue? That is more complicated. We would need to see financial records, prove that she submitted false receipts, establish a pattern. The HOA would probably need to file a complaint as well, since they would be the victim of the fraud. But the burglary charge is straightforward. I can pursue that based on what you have shown me. What happens next? I will need you to come in and make a formal statement. Bring all your evidence, the videos, the photos, the police report you filed earlier. I will also need a list of those neighbors who reported missing items. Then I will seek an arrest warrant." The seriousness of the situation hit me. Detective Morrison was talking about arrest warrants. Heather Kinsley, the HOA president who probably thought she was just being clever by supplementing her income with stolen supplies, was going to face criminal charges. I went to the police station the next morning and spent 2 hours with Detective Morrison, going through everything in detail. She was thorough and professional, taking careful notes and making copies of all my evidence. She said she would also need to interview the other residents who had reported missing items, and she would contact the HOA board about the financial records. "This might take a week or 2 to process," she said. "In the meantime, do not confront Miss Kinsley or discuss this investigation with anyone except the people I interview. We do not want to tip her off and give her a chance to destroy evidence or change her story." I agreed, though it was difficult to go about my normal routine knowing what was coming. I saw Heather a few times driving through the neighborhood, and each time I had to resist the urge to say something. She had no idea that her middle-of-the-night thefts had been caught on camera, no idea that a detective was building a case against her. The HOA meeting came around, the one where I was supposed to review financial records. I attended with my lawyer, an attorney named Marcus Stone, who I had consulted about the situation. Marcus was in his mid-40s with graying hair and a calm demeanor that suggested he had dealt with plenty of difficult situations in his career. Heather looked surprised and somewhat annoyed when I walked in with Marcus. "Mr. Zimmerman, I was not aware you were bringing legal representation to a simple records review. Given the nature of what I am investigating, I thought it was appropriate," I said. Her expression tightened, but she directed us to a table where several binders of financial records were laid out. "These are our records for the past 4 years. You are welcome to review them here. You may not remove them from the premises, but you can take notes." Marcus and I spent the next 3 hours going through the records. What we found was damning. Heather had submitted dozens of reimbursement requests for supplies. De-icing salt, fertilizer, water softener salt, cleaning products, all sorts of items. The total over 4 years exceeded $7,000. Each reimbursement was accompanied by a receipt, supposedly from various hardware stores and home improvement centers in the Springfield area. Marcus took detailed notes and photographed several pages with his phone. As we worked, Heather kept walking past, trying to appear casual but clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny. When we finished, Marcus asked Heather directly, "Can you provide documentation showing that these supplies are currently in the HOA storage shed or have been used for their intended purposes?" "What are you implying?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I am simply asking if you can account for these supplies. It is a reasonable question given the amount of money involved. We use supplies as needed. I do not keep detailed logs of every bag of salt spread on the sidewalks. But you do have purchasing records. Surely you track inventory in some fashion. This is ridiculous. Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Zimmerman?" Before I could respond, Marcus held up a hand. "We are simply reviewing records as is our right under HOA bylaws. Thank you for your cooperation. We will be in touch if we have further questions." We left, and once we were outside, Marcus said, "This is definitely evidence of embezzlement. Combined with your video evidence and the witness statements, you have a strong case. The detective will probably want copies of these records." I provided everything to Detective Morrison the next day. She said the case was coming together well, and that she expected to seek an arrest warrant within the week. 6 days later, on a cold Tuesday morning in January, I watched from my living room window as 2 police cars pulled up in front of Heather Kinsley's house. Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers walked to the front door. Heather answered, and even from a distance, I could see the shock and confusion on her face as Detective Morrison spoke to her. The conversation lasted several minutes. Then I saw Heather being led to one of the police cars in handcuffs. She was not fighting or making a scene, but her face was pale and she looked stunned. The police spent about an hour inside her house, presumably executing a search warrant. When they finally left, they took several boxes of materials with them. The neighborhood erupted in gossip within hours. By evening, my phone was ringing constantly with neighbors asking if I knew what had happened. I kept my responses vague, saying only that the police had been investigating thefts in the neighborhood and that people should contact Detective Morrison if they had information. The Springfield Journal-Register ran a story 2 days later. HOA president arrested on burglary and embezzlement charges. The article outlined the basic facts. Heather Kinsley had been charged with burglary, theft, and embezzlement in connection with a scheme to steal supplies from residents and defraud the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. The article mentioned that she had been caught on security camera footage entering a resident's garage without permission, and that financial records showed discrepancies in HOA supply purchases. I was contacted by the prosecutor's office and asked to testify before a grand jury. The proceedings were held in the Sangamon County Courthouse, an imposing stone building in downtown Springfield. I told my story to the grand jury, showing them the video evidence and explaining how I had discovered the thefts and the broader pattern of fraud. The grand jury returned indictments on multiple charges: burglary, theft, embezzlement, and fraud. The total amount of the embezzlement was calculated to be approximately $8,400 over a period of 4 years. While not a huge sum in the scheme of white-collar crime, it was enough to constitute a Class 3 felony in Illinois. Heather Kinsley hired a defense attorney, a woman named Linda Chen, who had a reputation for handling white-collar crime cases. Linda argued that the charges were overblown, that any discrepancies in the financial records were due to poor bookkeeping rather than intentional fraud, and that Heather had simply made a mistake in thinking she had permission to access resident garages for legitimate HOA purposes. But the video evidence was impossible to explain away. The footage clearly showed Heather entering my garage in the middle of the night, taking salt bags and leaving. There was no reasonable interpretation of those actions that was consistent with legitimate HOA business. The case went to trial in March. I testified, as did several of my neighbors who had experienced thefts. Detective Morrison presented the investigation findings. The prosecutor played the security camera footage for the jury, showing Heather's face clearly visible as she stole my property. Heather took the stand in her own defense, which most legal experts considered a risky move. She claimed that she had been trying to ensure all residents had access to necessary supplies during winter weather emergencies, that she had been acting in what she thought was the best interest of the community, and that she had gotten confused about the proper procedures. The prosecutor's cross-examination was devastating. "Miss Kinsley, why did you enter Mr. Zimmerman's garage at 2 in the morning?" I was checking on supplies. I wanted to make sure residents were prepared for the storm that was forecasted. By taking those supplies, I was going to redistribute them to residents who did not have enough, without asking, without permission. In the middle of the night, I thought I had the authority as HOA president, and the reimbursement requests. You submitted receipts claiming you had purchased supplies that you actually stole from residents. How do you explain that? That was a mistake. I got confused about which receipts were for which purchases. For 4 years. You were confused for 4 years. Heather had no good answer. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The sentencing hearing was held in April. The prosecutor recommended a sentence that included jail time, restitution to both the HOA and to individual residents, and probation. Heather's attorney argued for leniency, noting that she had no prior criminal record and that she had been under stress managing HOA responsibilities. Judge Mitchell Warren, who presided over the case, was not sympathetic. In his sentencing remarks, he said, "Miss Kinsley held a position of trust in her community. She was elected by her neighbors to manage their collective interests, and she abused that trust for personal gain. While the monetary amounts involved are not large by some standards, the betrayal of community trust is significant. She violated the privacy and security of her neighbors, entering their property without permission and stealing from them. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a sustained pattern of criminal behavior over multiple years." Judge Warren sentenced Heather Kinsley to 2 years in prison, with 1 year to be served, and 1 year suspended pending successful completion of probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and to individual residents, totaling approximately $9,000, including the value of stolen items and the cost of the investigation. Additionally, she was permanently barred from serving in any HOA leadership position and required to perform community service upon her release. Heather was taken into custody immediately to begin serving her sentence at the Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. Her house went on the market a few weeks later, and she moved out of Riverside Meadows entirely after her release. The Riverside Meadows HOA went through significant changes in the aftermath of the scandal. An emergency election was held to replace Heather and several other board members who resigned in embarrassment over their failure to catch the fraud sooner. New financial controls were implemented, including mandatory quarterly audits by an independent accounting firm. The bylaws were amended to require multiple board members to sign off on any reimbursement requests, and a new transparency policy made all financial records available online for resident review. I was asked to join the board given my role in uncovering the fraud, but I declined. I had no interest in HOA politics. I just wanted to live in my house peacefully without having my salt bag stolen. However, I did agree to serve on a new security committee that was formed to improve neighborhood safety and prevent future incidents. The committee implemented several changes: security cameras at all entrances to the community, better lighting in common areas, and a neighborhood watch program. We also arranged for a locksmith to rekey all the locks in the community, ensuring that no one held master keys that could be abused. Richard, my neighbor, was elected as the new HOA president. He ran on a platform of common sense and transparency, promising to focus on basic maintenance and safety rather than nitpicking residents over minor violations. Under his leadership, the atmosphere in Riverside Meadows became noticeably more relaxed and community-oriented. The stolen supplies were never fully recovered. Most had presumably been used or disposed of, and what remained in the HOA storage shed was legitimately purchased. I received restitution payments from Heather over time, though getting the full amount took several months as she struggled to come up with the money. One evening in May, after everything had settled down, I was sitting on my front porch with Richard, drinking beer and watching the sunset. The weather had warmed up considerably, and my garage was empty of de-icing salt, which was fine because I would not need it for months. "You know," Richard said, "I have lived in a lot of places over the years, but I have never seen anything quite like this." An HOA president caught on camera stealing salt bags. It is like something out of a dark comedy. It was surreal, I agreed. I still cannot believe she thought she could get away with it. People get comfortable in positions of power. They start to think the rules do not apply to them. Heather probably convinced herself that she deserved that money, that she was working so hard for the community that a little side income was justified. She could have just bought her own salt. Richard laughed. That is the thing, is it not? The salt itself was not even expensive. The whole scheme probably netted her less than she spent on lawyer fees trying to defend herself. If she had put that energy into a legitimate side job, she would have come out way ahead. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Richard said, "You did a good thing, Oliver. It took guts to pursue this when everyone else would have just written it off as a few missing bags of salt. You held someone accountable who thought they were above accountability." I shrugged. "I just wanted my salt bags back." "Well, you got a lot more than that. You got justice. And you helped clean up a corrupt situation that probably would have kept going for years otherwise." The next winter was remarkably different from the previous ones. I bought my de-icing salt early in the season, stacked it in my garage, and it stayed exactly where I put it. No mysterious disappearances, no middle-of-the-night thefts. My security cameras captured nothing more interesting than the occasional raccoon investigating my trash cans. The community seemed healthier too. People were more engaged, more willing to attend meetings and voice concerns. The new board was responsive and transparent, publishing detailed minutes of every meeting and maintaining open communication with residents. Several people mentioned to me that they felt better about paying their HOA dues now that they could see exactly where the money was going. I ran into Detective Morrison one day at a coffee shop downtown. She was in plain clothes off duty, but she recognized me immediately. "Oliver Zimmerman," she said, smiling. "How are things in Riverside Meadows these days?" "Much quieter," I said. "No more salt bag heists." That case was unusual, she admitted. Most HOA disputes are civil matters, not criminal, but the burglary charge was clear-cut, and once we started looking at the financial records, the fraud was obvious. It was good police work on your part, actually. You gathered solid evidence before coming to us. I just did not want to be told I was overreacting about stolen salt. You were not overreacting. Theft is theft, whether it is salt bags or jewelry, and betrayal of community trust is serious. People need to feel safe in their homes, secure in their property. What Heather Kinsley did violated that in a fundamental way. I thanked her for her work on the case, and we parted ways. As I drove home, I thought about how the whole experience had changed my perspective on community living. I had always been somewhat indifferent to the HOA, viewing it as a necessary annoyance that came with suburban life. But the scandal had shown me how important good governance and accountability were at every level, even in something as mundane as a homeowners association. The following spring, the Riverside Meadows newsletter featured an article about the changes implemented since what they delicately referred to as the leadership transition. The community had paid off its legal fees, recovered the embezzled funds through restitution payments, and actually ended the year with a surplus in the budget due to more careful financial management. The article included quotes from Richard about transparency and community engagement, and it mentioned the new security measures that had been implemented. My name was mentioned briefly as the resident who had first raised concerns about theft, but the article did not go into details. I appreciated the discretion. I had never wanted to be the center of attention in this situation. I just wanted my property to be secure and my community to be run honestly. Tom, the former treasurer who had served with Heather, stopped by my house one afternoon to apologize personally. He looked genuinely distressed as he stood on my doorstep. "Oliver, I wanted to say I am sorry," he said. "I should have been more careful with the financial oversight. I trusted Heather because she seemed so competent and organized, but I should have been doing proper audits. If I had been doing my job correctly, this could have been caught much earlier." "You were not the one who committed the crimes," I pointed out. "No, but I was in a position to prevent them and I failed. I resigned from the board because I felt I had let the community down." "That was your choice to make. But for what it is worth, I think you were a victim in this too. Heather was deliberately deceptive. She had years of practice at covering her tracks. You were not negligent, you were trusting." Tom seemed somewhat comforted by that, though I could tell he still felt guilty. He was one of those people who took responsibility seriously, and his failure to catch the fraud had hit him hard. Life in Riverside Meadows returned to normal, or at least to a new normal that was healthier than before. The scandal became part of the community history, the story that long-time residents told to newcomers as a cautionary tale about the importance of good governance and accountability. I kept my security cameras up and running. They had proven their worth, and I felt better having that extra layer of security. The footage they captured was now thoroughly boring. Me coming and going, deliveries being dropped off, the occasional neighbor walking their dog past my house. Exactly what it should be. One night in December, almost exactly a year after I had first discovered my missing salt bags, I was in my garage organizing winter supplies. I had bought 6 bags of de-icing salt, the same amount I had purchased the previous year. They sat in their designated corner, unmolested and secure. I also had a bag of sand, a snow shovel, an ice scraper, and all the other supplies I needed to handle whatever winter weather Illinois threw at me. Standing there in my garage with everything in its place and the security cameras quietly recording, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Not because Heather Kinsley had been caught and punished, though justice had certainly been served. But because I had stood up for myself and for my community when it would have been easier to just buy more salt and forget about it. I had proven that even small crimes matter, that accountability matters at every level, and that ordinary people can make a difference when they refuse to accept wrongdoing. My phone buzzed with a message from Richard asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. His wife was making chili, and several neighbors would be there. It was the kind of casual community gathering that happened more often now, people actually enjoying living in Riverside Meadows rather than just tolerating it. I locked up my garage, double-checking that everything was secure, and walked next door. The winter air was cold and crisp, and I could see my breath in the glow of the streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a snow plow preparing for the flurries that were forecasted overnight. Everything was as it should be. My salt was in my garage, my locks were secure, and my community was in good hands. The whole experience had taught me that vigilance matters, that trust must be earned and verified, and that sometimes the most mundane theft can reveal much larger problems. It had also reminded me that communities are only as strong as their willingness to hold their leaders accountable, and that sunshine really is the best disinfectant for corruption, no matter how small scale. As I walked into Richard's warm house and greeted my neighbors, I realized that we had all been through something together, something that had ultimately made our community stronger. We had confronted a problem, dealt with it honestly, and come out better on the other side. That was worth more than any number of bags of de-icing salt. The evening passed pleasantly with good food and better company. Someone mentioned that they had heard Heather was working at a retail store in Peoria after her release from prison, trying to rebuild her life far from Riverside Meadows. No one wished her ill, but no one missed her either. She had made her choices and faced the consequences, and the community had moved on. As I walked home later that night, my breath fogging in the cold air, I looked at my house with appreciation. It was more than just a building with a garage full of salt bags. It was my home, in a community that had learned important lessons about trust, accountability, and the importance of paying attention to the small things that can reveal larger truths. The security camera light blinked steadily above my garage door, a small red indicator that someone was watching, that my property was protected. Inside, my salt bags sat exactly where I had left them, waiting for the next ice storm, ready to serve their purpose. Everything was in its place, everything was secure, and everything made sense in a way that it had not a year ago. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and settled in for the night, confident that tomorrow I would wake up to find everything exactly as I had left it. And that simple certainty, that basic expectation of security and order, was something I would never take for granted again.